Content versus substance. I see this debate within Christian organizations, and I think it's a weird philosophical conflict. The debate has real ramifications for the world at large. Substance is certainly the factor that influences cultural direction, but most people barely look beyond the content critically. This habit has led the church, particularly the old guard, to make several mistakes in attempting to proselytize or keep the wider world somewhat sane. I believe that by ceding cultural ground over needless controversy, Christians have unintentionally encouraged proliferation of anti-Christian philosophy. One example I can think of is the organization Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, insisting D&D is a satanic recruitment tool. An objective look at the game itself, particularly earlier editions when the real panic occurred, do not substantively present themselves as anathema, but newer editions have demonstrated a predilection toward social radicalism. The problems apparent in D&D post-date the panic around it by nearly 40 years. As much as the slippery slope isn't a fallacy, I don't think that's what's going on here. The game isn't just a loose collection of rules, it's also a collaborative effort. So maybe the culture around the game is relevant. A quick glance at the online communities surrounding the game reveals a toxic cesspool of anti-Christian dogma. Extreme sexual degeneracy of nearly any variety is rampant. Questions about pronoun usage are common, and any rejection of underlying gender ideology is met with unthinking derision. It's not so clear to me that the few legitimate problems with the game led to cultural issues within the community. I think, instead, the reverse is true. The cultural issues in the community have incentivized poor choices on the part of the publishers. 40 years ago, no official published adventure would have had any characters where their sexual preferences or gender identity were truly relevant. The closest I can think of is first edition AD&D had restrictions on whether your character could be male or female at creation based on their strength score, an acknowledgement of biological tendencies if ever there was one. Waterdeep Dragon Heist was published in 2018, and every character that has a specified romantic interest is homosexual, and several characters are trans. The most egregious example of this is when one of the Drow characters, who is a trans man, and is good aligned. The Drow are supposed to be universally evil, but the spineless adventure authors couldn't allow a trans man, even one who is of a race unidimensionally evil, to be anything but praiseworthy. The seeds of the strain of this crisis of culture is visible elsewhere as well. Who can forget the panic surrounding Harry Potter of yesteryear? For whatever reason, many in the church decided that, rather than engaging with any philosophical issues within Harry Potter, it would be better to complain about it for having the audacity to include magic. Joanne Rowling may have ceded much of her legacy to anti-Christian ideologues, but the church's rejection of her magnum opus opened the door to this decision. Had the church made a more reasonable move, there may have been cultural pushback against the encroachment of more radical cultural forces. I suppose I should probably proffer an example of when the church didn't look merely at content to reject something, but actually encourage something due to its substance. The Chronicles of Narnia is an extraordinarily well-known fantasy series, bearing much of the same content that has, in other media, been a signal to the church that something was harmful. The difference in alacrity, so far as I can see, is that C.S. Lewis was already a notable apologist. I suppose good old Clive was able to cash in on the goodwill he received from his apologetics to publish an allegory with all the trappings the church had expressed disdain for. The church is obviously capable of distinguishing between content and substance. The church's failure to do so meaningfully has opened the floodgates of irrationality and anti-Christian thought into the mainstream. Maybe going forward, the church should discern more carefully about substance rather than the mere content.